Hello guys, welcome to another video, and in this one I'm going to go over my plans for Path of Exile to patch 0.3 launch, the Third Edict, and I'm going to be starting a gas grenade Pathfinder. So initially my plans were to actually start the new Mortar cannon totem skill, and I was pretty excited to actually try that out. You know, I was going to go for maybe a Warbringer or Tactician or even a Deadeye, and just kind of play around with different grenades. I think it's especially interesting to see exactly how the mechanics are going to function with that skill because, you know, based on how it works in PoE 1, it might be the case that each totem has its own cooldowns and its own charges, and when you actually spawn a totem, it could be that it spawns with the maximum charges, and then, you know, it just spams out your charges, at which point you wouldn't really need to invest into CDR to actually scale the damage because you just want to continuously spam your totems to be able to keep refreshing charges and getting all those charges out. But right now, all of that stuff is completely unknown. We don't really know how it's going to scale. And I think the fact that the totem itself actually scales the cooldown recovery rate of grenades kind of tells me that it might be the case that they share a cooldown and share charges. And if that's the case, I'm not convinced the skill is going to be that great as like a main damage dealer. We also have the case that the totems that are currently in the game have been updated in this patch to be kind of more supplementary damage. One of them has like a 25% attack speed multiplier, so it really feels like they want to kind of nerf the ability to use the totems as a main skill. But I think that alongside other kind of duration-based skills, they'll still be just fine. But basically, I don't really want to start Mortar Cannon anymore because I think that it might be a bit weak, and so I'm just going to stay away from it. It could be a second build. But yeah, that was my initial plan. Then I wanted to play a gas grenade build because I actually started to play gas grenade in 0.2 towards the end of my playtime in patch 0.2. I played a bit of gas grenade on a Acolyte of Chayula, and I really enjoyed the skill, but at that time I was kind of very burnt out on the league. I didn't really enjoy 0.2 all that much, and even though I was kind of enjoying the build, I just wasn't really feeling the urge to play all too much. So I want to kind of revisit gas grenade, and I think that after the changes to the Acolyte of Chayula, there might be something there for gas grenade, but I kind of want to play on a Pathfinder and go for a more basic setup, just scaling maximum poisons. So that's pretty much how I got here. Now, initially, my plan was to play gas grenade and then go for the new Pathfinder skill, which is the acidic concoction. But acidic concoction, when it was first revealed in the patch notes, was essentially going to be a thrown concoction. It's an unarmed skill, so you'd have to use it on your weapon swap if you were playing, you know, gas grenade on your main setup with a crossbow. And then how it was initially intended to work is that it would deal physical damage based on the highest expected remaining poison on the target. That's all of the poisons combined. And then it would deal 150% of that damage as unscalable physical damage. Now, the last time we had an unscalable skill like this in the game was Blood Hunt in patch 0.2, and even though it was unscalable, Blood Hunt could critically strike, and it could scale with more multipliers, and it could inflict ailments other than bleed. It could inflict poison, for example, and deal a lot of damage that way. And it looks like they've come in here overnight. This was my plan, like, as of last night I was going to play this skill, and they've come in overnight, and they've actually changed this now to cause life loss. So essentially, how this will work now is that you can actually throw the concoction to consume the poisons, and then it will deal 150% of the damage that was expected to be dealt by those poisons as life loss. I think that that will be actually a quite good build, but it's a lot more hands-on, and you essentially need to continuously stack poisons and then consume them over and over again. Part of the reason why I don't want to play this anymore is because there's actually a bug in the game right now, and I do expect that this bug's going to get fixed in this patch because, well, I'll explain why in a moment, but essentially the bug is that if you have an unarmed skill where, you know, you don't have a weapon equipped, you cannot automatically switch to that weapon set when you're using a skill. You have to manually switch because you can't assign that stuff in the character sheet, right? You can't actually do it like you normally would, where you just use the skill and automatically switch. I assume that that bug is going to be fixed. It may even be fixed by the time the patch goes live, because I know that a lot of people are going to be playing the unarmed, you know, monk setup with the new keystone. So I expect that that will be fixed in this patch. But that is something that, you know, I don't want to be like manually switching between weapon sets and stuff like that. I'm really looking for a much smoother playstyle. So with this change to acidic concoction, I decided that that is not what I want to be playing. So I'm going for a very basic gas grenade setup. I really enjoyed this skill in my short playtime in the last patch, so this is what I'm going for. I know for a fact that this is going to be fairly reliable. I'm not really going for anything new in the patch, but you know, I'm going to enjoy the build, so this is my plan. So let's kind of go over the guide. I've set up a guide here in Mobalytics, and I'll link this in the comment below and in the description as well. The basic setup is gas grenade is a grenade skill. It needs to use a crossbow. You fire grenades, which then explode to cause poison clouds. And I've done a lot of testing on poison clouds in the last patch to work out their exact mechanics. And there are some really interesting mechanics. For example, poison clouds cannot critically strike. So that's one extreme limiting factor there. You can't scale the poison with crit. But as a result of that, the damage that is dealt by gas grenade is exceptionally high, the attack damage multiplier, which makes it really good for inflicting poisons at a baseline. It means that you can invest into lots of poison magnitude and, you know, increase damage and stuff instead of going for crit. So that is actually just fine. And then the poison cloud also doesn't need accuracy. It completely bypasses the chance to hit calculation, so you don't need any kind of accuracy scaling. Now we're going to be using Pathfinder, which means we have access to contagious contamination, which is going to basically spread poisons, and this is going to help our clear massively. That's how we solve clear in the build. And then Pathfinder also has overwhelming toxicity to double the amount of poison stacks that we can have, and this is basically where we solve the single target damage. We also have a bunch of supporting skills. We have Despair, which is very straightforward, just lowers the monster chaos resistance to make them take more chaos damage from poison. Withering Presence is very much the same thing. It applies Wither, which makes them take increased chaos damage. And then we're going to have Ripwire Ballista, which I believe has been renamed perhaps to Artillery Ballista in the patch. But this one is basically just a complete support totem. It's going to have a blind link to it. It's going to provide an area to generate rage and increase our mana regen and things like that. These things here are really only useful for bosses. We're not going to need to use Despair on trash mobs. You know, we're not going to need to use Ripwire Ballista or whatever the ballista is going to be called on any trash mobs. It's just going to be for when we get to a tanky target. Not necessarily just bosses, might include essence rares and things like that, but yeah, you're mostly only going to need to drop gas grenade on the ground for, you know, progressing along with normal mapping and things like that. Then we're a, you know, right-hand side build, which means that we're using Wind Dancer and Ghost Dance, pretty stock standard defensive setup, taking Energy Shield and Evasion. The big question mark here for the right side of the build for defenses is how the new passive tree is going to play out and how deflection is going to work exactly. We still don't know if it's going to roll on non-pure dex gear. So for example, is it going to roll on hybrid gear? And even if it does roll on hybrid gear, how useful is it going to be? We're not sure on any of that just yet. The build is going to be leveling between Acts 1 and 3 with a pretty basic crossbow setup. I'm going to be using Explosive Grenade from the get-go and then grab Scatter Shot straight away. This is just a giant damage boost on Explosive Grenade. This pretty much solves all of your single target troubles in the early acts, but the problem is clear with Explosive Grenade, so that's where we'll be using Contagion. And this is really, really strong, especially in Act 1. Contagion is exceptionally good in those zones where you get like a lot of monsters. For example, where you fight the Rust King, you get all those monsters in a big group, and you can just basically drop a Contagion on the weakest enemy or a couple of weak enemies. Then you can drop Explosive Grenades on top of that group, and they'll just disappear, right? So that's going to be really nice. Then we have the updated high velocity rounds, which will now essentially store damage from a previous hit, which you can then activate to keep dealing damage like that. I think it's 5% of the physical damage from that hit, but only on broken armor targets, which is where Gas Grenade comes in. We'll be using Gas Grenade with Corrosion. And a little bit later on there, we'll also kind of use this as a clearing setup, Gas Grenade combined with Contagion, because you can then spread the poisons between targets and, you know, keep the Contagion debuff going like that. So this is essentially going to be, you know, clearing setup is going to be Contagion and Gas Grenade, and then if you find a tanky target, you can also drop your Explosive Grenades. And for bossing, you're going to be pre-stacking Explosive Grenade if you know where the boss is going to be spawning. And then the general rotation on boss is just going to be high velocity rounds on a broken armor boss. you just got to keep gas grenade up so they continuously breaks that armor. And Herald of Ash is just there for a bit of bonus clear. Sometimes you'll find that there's some stragglers left, for example, and Herald of Ash is really good, especially with Explosive Grenade, because you get a lot of overkill damage, and any stragglers that are left are just going to be melting to that ignite. So this is going to be Act 1 through 3, and then when we get our second Ascension and actually get the double poison node, that's when you can start considering swapping over to Gas Grenade. To actually make the swap, you're going to need to make sure that you have a good weapon with a decent amount of flat elemental damage or increased elemental damage with attacks, gem levels for projectile skills, that sort of thing. And you're also going to want rings with good flat damage, especially flat elemental damage. And you're also going to want to get your Plague Finger going at that point. And, you know, that's because there isn't that many good support gems if you're not going elemental poison. So we're going to be using Primal Armament for that reason, to scale that elemental damage into poison, and then there's Concentrated Effect and Suffuse there to actually kind of counter the downside of Concentrated Effect. And at this stage, we're going to be using Withering Presence for a bit of a damage boost, and Despair as well. Again, these things are more kind of single target based. But early on, you know, Wind Dancer and Ghost Dance, that sort of stuff isn't really all that useful, because one of the things that happens during leveling is you find really good gear. Let's say you find a really good pair of boots. It has increased movement speed and resists and life and things like that, but it's on the complete wrong base, right? Let's say it's a pure armor base. Well, at that point, your Wind Dancer is not scaling your evasion from that armor base, and you know, you're not going to get much effectiveness from Ghost Dance. And that's also the reason why on the passive tree, if I scroll down here to the passive tree, this is going to be kind of the leveling setup. We go through some damage nodes early on, and we go up here and grab this Blinding Strike damage wheel for a bunch of increased damage. Then we start to take poison things here and gradually go down here for the grenade swap. The reason why we're not really taking any defensive nodes early on is because you just can't guarantee what you're gaining from your gear. You're mostly relying on your, you know, life scaling and things like that. So you can see here, once you've actually taken that stuff down here and you've actually swapped into Gas Grenade, I recommend that you path up here and grab the extra poison here. And this, generally, you're just going to be wanting to take a bunch of damage stuff, like grabbing all this poison scaling and this damage, rather than the defensive nodes early on, because, as I said, you can't really guarantee what your gear is going to be like early on. You may have really good gear pieces, but they're the complete wrong base types. They provide, you know, armor instead of evasion, and they may even, in some cases, not provide much of any defense at all because they just have really good affixes and you want to keep using them. So ignore most of this defense stuff until much later on. You just want to, you know, scale up your damage. Now, speaking of endgame, I will quickly go over some endgame upgrades that you can go for. This is going to be much later into the build. In many cases, these things are going to be very expensive, but they do provide huge power boosts. There's Prism of Belief, for example, which is a unique jewel that can grant up to +3 gem levels for a particular skill. In this case, you want Gas Grenade gem levels. That's going to be a huge upgrade. One thing to note about that is that in this patch, we believe there's going to be significant scaling for mana cost, and mana cost has been a huge problem in Path of Exile 2 ever since the launch. When you kind of scale up a skill past a certain gem level, the increases to mana cost start to become ridiculous to the point where you can no longer use the skill. I don't expect that to be the case anymore after this patch, because they said they've addressed it, but that is one thing to note. It may be the case that this kind of boosts the mana cost way too much, and it's really awkward to use the skill at that point. Then we have From Nothing, which is a jewel that essentially provides a radius over a particular keystone, and then you can allocate nodes within that radius without them being attached to your tree. And we want that for Chaos Inoculation, which will allow us to allocate Pure Chaos, which is 11% damage as extra Chaos. This is literally 11% more damage. And then also Wither Away to help us scale up our Wither effect. And you have new upgrades in this patch. For example, we have exceptional items which are coming into the game, which are going to be, you know, boosted quality gear. And one of those things is going to be an extra socket, which means you can, in theory, get an exceptional Plague Finger, which will mean you have 2 sockets on it, and then you can corrupt it for a 3rd socket, and that means, you know, you can get even more socketables for more stats, essentially, which is a huge upgrade. And of course, you can get other exceptional gear for, you know, high quality body armor, for example, for big evasion and things like that. There's lots of upgrades you can do. And another thing I want to just discuss briefly on the endgame is that I am going to be doing a test at some point during the progression of this build on a very kind of late game setup where I don't use Plague Finger and I instead use Snakebite. That would be a pure Phys setup, so no elemental damage scaling whatsoever. Snakebite is a unique glove that actually grants +1 to your poison count, which would be +2 because we're Pathfinder. In that case, I would need, flat Phys on rings and a crossbow, which is pure Phys scaling. And I kind of want to test that. That would be an 8 poison count instead of 6, but I'm actually not convinced that that's better than 6 poisons with elemental scaling. I'd have to do some testing to see exactly how that's going to work out. But that is pretty much it. Overall, I just wanted to kind of go over my plans for league starting. I'm going to be updating this guide as I progress. And, one thing to mention there is that we don't have the passive tree information, which means there's bound to be changes on the passive tree, wheels that you want to take. For example, there's probably going to be some deflection stuff that I want to go for. So there will be updates to the passive tree. But that is pretty much my plans for the 0.3 league start. It's going to be a gas grenade Pathfinder, which I think should be a very reliable build for a league starter. And that's going to be pretty much it. I wish everyone the best of luck with their 0.3 league start. Thank you for watching this video, and as always, stay tuned and stay safe.